Matthew's life was filled with simple moments, yet each one was rich with love and care. His mother had a way of turning cold mornings into something special with the smell of fresh pancakes and the sound of her gentle laughter echoing through the house. Richard, his father, was a devoted man, and Aunt Emily was always around, ready with playful games and kind advice. The family seemed complete, wrapped in a bubble of happiness. For Matthew, there was no place safer or more full of love than his home. But all of that changed on the fateful day his mother died in a car accident. The loss hit like a shadow quickly spreading through their lives. The funeral was a painful event, a test for everyone who had loved such a vibrant woman. Matthew, only 12 years old, stood silently, unable to fully process what was happening. Beside him, Richard looked like a broken man, his sadness weighing heavily on his shoulders, while Morgana, a woman Matthew had seen only a few times, offered comforting support. Morgana was always there, her presence subtle yet increasingly constant. She moved closer to Richard, saying the right words and offering the comfort he, vulnerable and grieving, so desperately needed. As Matthew felt more alone, like he was adrift in a sea of pain, his father emotionally drifted away, leaving him with a growing sense of abandonment. Morgana's introduction into their lives was swift, yet it seemed natural to everyone around them. However, to Matthew, something about her was unsettling. There was an unexplainable feeling that she carried something disturbing, something that made him uneasy. Richard's grief was not a short process. He sank deeper into his sorrow, distancing himself even more from Matthew. The days when father and son would play and talk together were long gone, and the laughter that once filled the house had become only a distant memory. Morgana, however, was ever present. Her comfort became vital to Richard, and within months, she had taken a permanent place in their home. They married in a small, quiet ceremony, without much fuss. After the wedding, the family dynamic changed entirely. Morgana took over the household, setting new rules. For Matthew, these changes were not only uncomfortable but increasingly oppressive. Morgana's loving behavior toward Richard was starkly contrasted by her coldness toward him. Instead of becoming the mother figure Matthew had hoped for, she became a distant, almost hostile presence. The gap between father and son grew wider. Whenever Matthew tried to talk to Richard, Morgana would interrupt, redirecting the conversation back to herself. She subtly manipulated their interactions, ensuring that Matthew never had a moment alone with his father. The pain of losing his mother was now compounded by a new kind of hurt, the feeling that his father was slowly disappearing from his life, not by choice but because of Morgana's invisible control. Aunt Emily, always a constant and loving figure, tried to intervene. She knew something was wrong. She tried to speak with Richard, to warn him about Morgana's controlling behavior, but her efforts were in vain. Morgana, always one step ahead, found ways to distance Emily, and before long, she too disappeared from Matthew's life. The boy's loneliness deepened. Now, Matthew was left alone. His only companions were the memories of the happiness that once filled his home. And as he watched his life being slowly taken over by Morgana, he knew deep down that something was terribly wrong. The days dragged on in the house that had once been full of life and joy. Now, all that remained was an oppressive silence and a constant sense of being watched. Morgana had transformed every aspect of Matthew's life into something painful and restrictive. She imposed strict rules about where he could go, what he could do, and even whom he could speak with. Most of the time, he wasn't allowed to talk to anyone. His once frequent and natural conversations with his father were now always mediated by Morgana, who made sure Matthew was never alone with Richard. Over time, confinement in the attic became his reality. The space, once used to store memories and forgotten items, was now Matthew's prison. The attic was dark, dusty, and silent, mirroring the emotional isolation he felt. A small window offered a limited view of the outside world, just enough for Matthew to feel how cut off he was from the life happening outside. Richard, lost in his grief, barely noticed what was happening. Morgana controlled his interactions with his son, always providing an excuse or justification to keep them apart. Matthew began to lose hope that his father would rescue him from this isolation. He couldn't understand how someone who had loved him so much could ignore the suffering he was enduring. But despite all the control Morgana exerted, Matthew began to notice small details that suggested she wasn't just cold and authoritarian. There was something darker about her actions. She seemed obsessed with having total control over the household, and Matthew felt that he was merely an obstacle in her way. With each passing day, his fear of Morgana grew, but along with the fear, a determination arose to uncover what she truly wanted. The forced confinement gave Matthew plenty of time to reflect and observe. He remembered his Aunt Emily, how she had vanished from their lives soon after Richard and Morgana's wedding. That absence had always bothered him, but now, with so much time alone, his unease grew. Something was wrong, he could feel it. Cut off from social interaction and locked in the attic, Matthew began investigating the few clues he had. He recalled small conversations he had overheard between Morgana and Richard, details that had seemed insignificant at the time but now took on a new meaning. Certain expressions, prolonged silences, and Emily's sudden disappearance all began to paint a disturbing picture in his mind. During one of his quiet explorations in the attic, Matthew found something that reinforced his suspicions. Hidden among dusty objects in an old box, he discovered letters and documents that had belonged to his mother. They were papers he had never seen before, but what caught his attention the most was the mention of a significant life insurance policy. Something Morgana might want to control. He realized there was more at stake than just a cruel stepmother. Morgana could be plotting something against the entire family and might even have been involved in Emily's disappearance. Matthew knew he had to be careful. He wasn't sure how to approach his father with these discoveries, as Richard seemed to be entirely under Morgana's control. At the same time, anger and fear were building inside him. With each new detail he uncovered, he became more convinced that he needed to act before it was too late. He was determined to uncover the truth, but he knew this would bring him into direct conflict with Morgana, and the consequences could be severe. The days in the attic seemed endless, but for Matthew, every moment of solitude was an opportunity to uncover more about the secrets surrounding him. He continued to sift through the papers and letters he had found. Among seemingly unimportant documents, one stood out. It was an old letter, written by his mother to Emily, expressing suspicions about Morgana. The letter seemed like a warning to his aunt, something that now connected to Emily's sudden disappearance. As Matthew analyzed every detail, the anxiety of being caught by Morgana grew. She often came up to the attic to check that he was following the rules, but Matthew always made sure to hide everything he found. Her visits were a constant reminder that he was being watched, and any misstep could cost him dearly. During one of these visits, Morgana began asking more probing questions. She noticed the change in Matthew's behavior, and the tension between them was palpable. However, Matthew managed to keep up a facade, maintaining an air of obedience while secretly planning his next steps. He knew he couldn't trust anyone in the house, except himself. Now, with these new documents in hand, he was more convinced than ever that Morgana had something to hide, something dangerous. Matthew then remembered the small attic window. Though he couldn't leave, perhaps he could find a way to communicate with the outside world. He decided he needed to contact Emily. It was his only chance of getting help, as his aunt knew Morgana well enough to understand what was really going on. With renewed determination, Matthew found a way to send a message to his Aunt Emily. Using the limited materials he had in the attic, he wrote a brief letter, explaining his suspicions and asking for help. The letter was carefully worded to avoid raising suspicion in case it was intercepted. He knew that if Morgana found out, his chances of escaping the situation would be destroyed. Getting the message out was a challenge in itself. Morgana controlled the house with an iron fist, and any attempt at communication was severely restricted. However, Matthew counted on the fact that she couldn't watch every corner of the house all the time. During one of Morgana's rare outings, he discreetly delivered the letter to a neighbor who had connections to Emily. His hope was that the message would reach her in time. The following days were filled with tension. Matthew didn't know if his message had been delivered, and Morgana seemed more suspicious than ever. Her questions became more frequent, and her punishments more severe. Richard remained a distant figure, completely consumed by grief and Morgana's manipulations. The father who once protected and loved him now seemed unrecognizable. Finally, a response from Emily arrived. It wasn't a long letter, but it was enough to confirm Matthew's worst fears. His aunt was alive but had been forced to disappear because of Morgana, who was manipulating the family to gain control of the insurance money. Emily mentioned she was trying to gather evidence and would return to help Matthew as soon as she could. This confirmation strengthened Matthew's resolve, but it also put him on high alert. Morgana couldn't find out they were in contact. As he waited for Emily to return, Matthew knew time was running out. Morgana, increasingly paranoid, intensified her control. The final confrontation was approaching, and he needed to be prepared. The tension in the house grew with each passing day. Now that Matthew knew his Aunt Emily was alive and aware of Morgana's plan, he began to act more cautiously. However, Morgana also seemed more vigilant. Every move Matthew made was watched. Every word he spoke was coldly measured by his stepmother. She didn't know that he was aware of her plans, but her suspicion was evident. One of those tense nights, Morgana finally decided to confront Matthew. She found him in the attic, where he spent most of his time. "Do you think you can deceive me?" she asked, her voice as cold as a blade. Though scared, Matthew tried to remain calm. He knew that denying everything could make things worse, but directly confronting her in that moment could be dangerous. "I don't know what you're talking about," Matthew replied, his voice controlled. But Morgana didn't believe him. She accused him of trying to sabotage her marriage to Richard, of making up stories to drive them apart. Without giving him a chance to defend himself, she threatened to send him to a distant boarding school, a place where he would have no contact with anyone, except through supervised letters. Fear gripped Matthew, but he also felt a new wave of determination. He knew that if he was sent away, it would be the end of any chance to expose Morgana. Despite his fear, Matthew found the courage to stand firm. "I know what you did to Emily," he said, feeling the tension in the air intensify. Morgana's expression shifted. For the first time, she seemed shaken. Without another word, she left him alone in the attic, but not before casting a look of pure hatred his way. Matthew knew his words had struck a blow, but he also knew that now he was in real danger. Days had passed since the confrontation, and Matthew could feel time slipping away. Morgana had become more calculated and cold, taking even more control over Richard's life and monitoring Matthew's every move with increasing intensity. However, the boy was determined to resist. He knew his Aunt Emily was on her way, and that gave him a glimmer of hope. Finally, on a quiet night, Emily managed to secretly contact Matthew. She had returned to town, prepared to confront Morgana and expose her crimes. The reunion between aunt and nephew was brief but filled with emotion. Emily revealed that she had uncovered enough evidence to bring Morgana down, including documents directly linking the stepmother to the disappearance of a large portion of the life insurance money from Matthew's mother. Together, they devised a plan. Emily knew that to confront Morgana effectively, it had to be done in Richard's presence. Though he was emotionally distant, the undeniable proof would be enough to break Morgana's hold on him. Matthew and Emily knew it was risky, but it was their only chance to free the family from Morgana's grip. As Emily and Matthew prepared for the final confrontation, Morgana grew more uneasy, sensing that something was slipping out of her control. She intensified her threats against Matthew, trying to break his spirit. But with Emily's support, the boy was stronger than ever. Morgana's time was running out, and Matthew knew that soon the truth would come to light. The tension in the house was almost unbearable. After Emily's secret return and the revelations they planned to expose, Matthew could hardly contain his anxiety. Every movement felt critical, and any mistake could ruin all their efforts to expose Morgana. However, something Matthew hadn't anticipated was happening. His father, Richard, was starting to notice that something wasn't right. Small inconsistencies in Morgana's behavior, once ignored by him, now stood out with disturbing clarity. Richard couldn't understand why Matthew seemed more distant than ever, and why, every time he tried to talk to him, Morgana would find a way to interrupt. He began to notice quick, uncomfortable glances between Matthew and Morgana, as if a silent war was being waged that he wasn't part of. Distrust began to grow inside him, along with a restlessness that led him to pay more attention to everything happening around him. In one such moment, Richard entered Matthew's room and found the boy sitting by the window, staring outside. It was a rare moment when Morgana wasn't around to control their interaction. "Matthew, is everything okay?" he asked, his voice carrying a genuine concern Matthew hadn't heard in a long time. Matthew hesitated, but his father's worried expression made him lower his guard for a moment. "Dad, haven't you ever wondered why Aunt Emily disappeared so suddenly?" he asked, his voice trembling but full of hope that Richard was finally beginning to see things as they really were. Richard remained silent for a moment, clearly taken aback by the question. He shook his head slowly, as if he was starting to piece together the puzzle. I trusted what Morgana told me, that Emily needed some time away. But now," he trailed off, reflecting on the past few weeks. Doubt was clearly taking root. This brief conversation, however, was interrupted by Morgana's arrival, appearing like a shadow in the doorway, her eyes fixed on Richard and Matthew. She didn't say anything, but her gaze spoke volumes. She knew that the control she had over the family was starting to slip through her fingers. The moment of truth had arrived. Matthew and Emily knew they couldn't wait any longer. If they were to have any chance of exposing Morgana before she acted, they needed to be direct and effective. That night, while the house was quiet and Richard was reading in his office, Emily decided it was time to reveal everything. With the documents in hand, she and Matthew made their way downstairs, their hearts pounding. When they reached the office, Richard looked up at them in surprise. Before he could speak, Emily laid the papers on the table. "Richard, you need to see this," she said, her voice firm yet full of compassion. What followed was a moment of complete silence as Richard looked at the documents, revealing not only the embezzlement of the insurance money, but also Morgana's manipulations to isolate him emotionally from his son. Richard's reaction was slow, as if each new discovery was a stab to his heart. He looked at Emily, then at Matthew, and finally at the door, where Morgana stood watching everything from a distance. The shock in his eyes was undeniable, but Richard knew it was time to confront her. He rose to his feet, walking slowly toward Morgana. "Morgana, is this true?" he asked, his voice low but full of authority. Morgana, who had always been able to manipulate Richard, could no longer hide the truth. She tried to argue, claiming it was all a misunderstanding, but the evidence was too clear. Devastated, Richard shook his head. You destroyed our family," he said, his voice trembling with emotion. The tension reached its peak as Morgana, realizing she had no way out, attempted to flee the house. But Emily, always one step ahead, had already alerted the authorities. Morgana was apprehended before she could escape, and finally, the lies she had built up for so long were exposed for all to see. The bond between Richard and Matthew, which had been so broken by Morgana, began to be restored in that moment. Richard, still shaken, apologized to his son. "I'm so sorry, Matthew. I should have seen what was happening," he said, hugging his son for the first time in a long while. The connection, though fragile, was being rebuilt. With Morgana out of their lives, Emily, Richard, and Matthew stayed together, finally free to begin rebuilding what had been destroyed. The house, once cloaked in shadows, now began to fill with renewed light. The air, once heavy with Morgana's control, was now light, as if the very structure of the home was healing from the long period of darkness. With Morgana gone, Matthew finally felt like he could breathe again, and Richard, though deeply shaken, seemed determined to reconnect with his son. The first days after Morgana's arrest were marked by reflective silences. Though physically present, Richard was still wrestling with the guilt of having been manipulated and of not having protected Matthew as he should have. Matthew, for his part, tried to make sense of having his father back. After so much emotional separation, it felt strange to try and reconnect. Emily played a crucial role in this process. Not only did she help reorganize the house, clearing it of the last remnants of Morgana, but she also guided Richard and Matthew through the emotional healing process. Sitting down to dinner as a family, something that had once seemed impossible, became a new ritual, albeit a tentative one, filled with unspoken tensions. One evening, Richard finally found the words Matthew had been waiting to hear for so long. "I failed you, Matthew," he said, his voice heavy with the sincerity of the confession. "I was so lost in my own grief that I didn't see what was happening around us. And you faced all of this alone. I'm sorry, Matthew." His eyes welling with tears, didn't know how to respond at first. But seeing the genuine remorse on his father's face, he felt that forgiveness was possible. "I just wanted you to hear me, to see me," Matthew replied, his voice trembling. Richard nodded, now fully understanding the weight of his actions, or rather, his inactions. The reconciliation wasn't instant, but it was the beginning of a new chapter for both of them. Slowly, the walls that had risen between father and son began to fall. Richard made more of an effort to spend time with Matthew, and the two began to rediscover the bond they had lost. With Emily by his side, Richard also decided to seek help to process his grief and the guilt that had consumed him. He knew it wouldn't be an easy journey, but he was committed to being the father Matthew deserved. The house, once dominated by secrets and manipulation, was now becoming a place of love, reconciliation, and hope. Matthew, stronger after all the trials, felt that despite everything he had lost, he now had the chance to start over. This time, with the certainty that he was no longer alone.